It's my great pleasure to be hosting this afternoon's panel event with three rather distinguished guest speakers. I'm delighted to be joined by Hendrik Toit, Chief Executive of 91, Amal-Lee Amin, Director of Climate Strategy at CDC Group, and we're particularly honoured to be joined this afternoon directly from South Africa by Pravin, Gordhan, South Africa's Minister for Public Enterprises. I look forward to hearing from these distinguished guests in just a moment or two. However, I thought I'd set the scene a little bit, given the scale of announcements that we've witnessed at COP26 here today. It really has shown the centrality of financial services in grasping the challenge of climate change and the role that investment management is playing in seeking to address those challenges. As an industry, we are stepping up to the plate. And already we've heard today of GFAN's announcement of 130 trillion of deployable capital. And we've heard the announcement of the establishment of the ISSB. It really does seem that the money and the plumbing to make good use of it are coming into force as a result of COP26. Exciting times indeed. Well, for me, COP26 has always been about that international level of diplomacy, but for this one, it seems that it's diplomacy matched by the muscle to deploy financial services might as well. And certainly in the run-up to COP26, I was hoping that we'd hear a lot more about countries declaring more on their nationally determined contributions, and we've certainly seen some of that. We'd see rich nations making good on their pledge to provide 100 billion a year for climate finance. A little bit delayed, but it seems that a glide path has now been established to achieve that. And of course, we'd have real action to protect communities and natural habitats. And I don't think you can walk around Glasgow at the moment without getting the message of the importance of making sure that that happens this time. Well, we in the UK, here in the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, have seen the benefit of carbonising the economy. But of course, we're now in the second revolution, which is to strip out carbon from the economy. And often, when you're in the middle of that revolution, it's hard to tell what's going on. But it's great that the UK is doing its bit now and actually championing the role of decarbonising the economy. Of course, our own industry, investment management, is no laggard in this regard. And already we have seen our members pledge up to £7 trillion of assets under management into that net zero commitment. Well, it's true that emerging economies may suffer the worst effects of climate change, with temperature rises, droughts, rising sea levels, making parts of the world inhospitable and perhaps even uninhabitable. Developed nations have an obligation to make sure that this simply doesn't happen. And of course, finance, our industry, has got a pivotal role to play in that as well. And so that's really why it's important that we have this new partnership between policymakers and our industry if we are going to play the role that I know everybody who's joining us today wants to achieve. And that's why this Green Horizon Summit is particularly important. Now, as I've said, we've three outstanding experts, and we're looking forward to hearing from each of them individually. But it gives me great pleasure to actually start by inviting Minister Gordhan to offer the South African government's view on what he would like to see out of COP26, and perhaps the role that finance can play in making it happen too. Minister Gordhan, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to my two fellow panelists. I suppose the one thing that all of us are looking for is a lot of cash coming out of your pockets towards the emerging markets, but also commitments to decarbonize that are, on the one hand, realistic, but on the other hand, deliverable as well, and indeed measurable, as your industry would say. I think the good thing about the journey, particularly the last few weeks to COP26, has been the fact that we all agree that climate change, as you've described, is a serious hazard to humanity as a whole, that clearly we need to undergo, as different countries, societies, and economies, a transition, but not just a transition, a just transition. There are, if you like, moral, economic, and social issues that all of us can very easily find common ground on if we have the will. And at the same time, the debate about money, the debate about per capita emissions, the debate about how particularly the emerging markets move away from a coal-based electricity system, and indeed the developed world does the same without taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, is the crucial question that actually confronts us. And although you are in Glasgow, a long time ago we learned the little phrase, mind the gap. And I think what I hope the COP26 is able to achieve is closing the gap between the world views amongst the advanced economies and the emerging markets, closing the gap as far as the different business cultures that both our worlds, closing the gap as far as the contributions, but also the innovation that the financial sector is required to make and is making, as you've pointed out already in your introductory remarks, but also understanding the real world in which South Africa and other countries operate in relation to the kind of reserves that they have of coal, the dependence on coal as a basis for generating electricity, but at the same time, the potential that exists given wind and other attributes that countries like our own has for an effective green economy to actually develop. And ultimately, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these themes, what we've got to do is to reconceptualize risk and the balance between risk and reward, as far as your industry is concerned in a traditional sense, and work out how best to contribute finances in a sustainable way. So in as much as the transition is important, the financial assistance and contributions that are made are equally important. In other words, we need to ensure that we don't break the bank, so to speak. We recognize the kind of constraints under which countries like South Africa and many others operate. The actual human toll that a badly managed transition can actually have on workers, on communities, both around power stations and in the coal mines themselves. And at a micro level, we've got to also appreciate, as part of understanding the economic potential of countries like South Africa, the transition not just on the electricity side, but also in the production of electric vehicles, innovations around green hydrogen that is taking place here, and more precisely, having agreed on the big idea, so to speak, what does change actually mean at a day-to-day level? What are the mechanics that we will have to engage in moving workers from working in a coal-powered station to working on a renewable plant? And how do we work in this particular regard in contexts like the one that we specifically find in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world as well? So it's both a challenging time, but equally importantly, it's an exciting time, a time that requires all of us to think differently, imagine the next 10 to 15 years in a very different way, and ask some tough questions about what kind of inheritance we leave behind for the younger generations as well. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. And if I could turn to you for the first question as well. We all appreciated the article in the Financial Times by the South African President earlier this week. And he touched on many of the themes that you've been able to explore with us this afternoon. One of them was around the need for transition and transition finance. And you mentioned coal mining. As the son of a Yorkshire coal miner, I'm very aware of the difficulty of managing that transition, actually, of keeping communities together through those transitions. So I wondered if I could ask you to say a little bit more about the role that finance can play in helping finance economies through that transition. What can we do practically that's going to be of most support?
Well, in the first instance, to get the balance right between grant finance and concessional finance, and then in relation to concessional finance, to establish how concessional is concessional. And as I pointed out earlier on, it has to be concessional in the sense that we don't break the bank, or put in a different way, it is ultimately fiscally sustainable. Secondly, money is required and has been provided in the form of grants by several instances. For Eskom, for example, to do its initial work and studies around a power plant called Komati that is about to be decommissioned, and the kind of implications that the closure of that will have for workers and communities that surround that plant in the broadest sense. But equally importantly, it's been an opportunity to experiment and innovate. So the Eskom colleagues have developed what they call microgrids, which can be utilized to light up somewhere between 100 and 150 households in that vicinity. Secondly, they've developed agri-grids. This is where land is utilized for the location of solar PV, but at the same time, energy is utilization and other purposes as well. And then thirdly, land around that power station could be used, if we have the right kind of financing, for the investment in renewable projects in the environment and land that we have around that power station. But that's part one. Two, as I pointed out earlier on, is the actual mechanics of implementation, where a very skilled group of people are going to be required, both at the level of technology, technically speaking, but secondly, in investing in institutions and training capacity, but equally importantly, building the right relationships with trade unions, as you know, which is a crucial institution in the South African ecosystem as well, and building the right relationships with communities and community leaders. And I imagine that early in the new year, once the financing issues have been resolved, the tire hits the road and these projects get off the ground. And by the middle of the year, we begin to learn the first lessons of what it means to undertake a transition and how do we apply those lessons to other power stations within that particular region as well. So I think the President of Africa is essentially saying, in a constrained fiscal environment, the kind of contribution that has been agreed between some of the developed economies in South Africa to the tune of $8.6 billion is a very good start. But as marked out earlier on, the world is going to actually require $1 trillion at a time per year in order to effectively find funding for the different texts in which the transition needs to actually occur. And South Africa have, as Hendrik Toit will tell you, the financial technology, so to speak, and capability to manage these funds in a way in which an optimum amount of crowding in takes place, or private sector funding, but equally as is affordable, the provision of public financing as well. So a new set of opportunities, in a sense, begin to develop for different types of financial products. I'm sure your industry is beginning to look at, utilized in a way in which they are appropriate to the different contexts in which they need to operate.
Thank you, Minister. That's very helpful, very clear. Hendrik, you were mentioned by the Minister as somebody who thinks deeply about these issues, which we know that's the case anyway. So what, from the industry's perspective, do we want from policymakers? What is it that we can do in partnership with them to make sure emerging and developing markets get the finance they need to finance the transition?
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Minister. Very simple, really, and it's predictability and clarity, and very important. And I'm very proud that South Africa has taken the route it's taken by just putting it out there, showing its willingness to engage in the transition in a very committed and professional way. I think the next step is, besides showing the willingness, is to be clear about the longevity of the policy framework, and then match, and the age-old trick, blend or match the governmental or official finance the country can access with private sector. I mean, the world has done a shocking job on this. If we just look back the last 4 or 5 years, on average, instead of the $1 trillion that we should have invested to rebuild the emerging market energy systems and infrastructure platforms, we've done about 240. And if you look at climate-specific finance, the private sector has been way below capacity, or the cross-border private sector in participating. And I think my challenge back to the Minister and to any developing or any emerging market is, be very forceful and clear about your framework, about your willingness to engage, about the economic opportunity you're going to pursue, and then stick to it, because the market will look for those opportunities, and the world knows it hasn't done a good job.
Absolutely. That consistency of framework and approach, that gives investors all the confidence that we need, rather than
Chris, sorry to interrupt you. We have an advantage that we're in a world where developed market assets have near zero or negative yields, low risk assets. The emerging world pays a return on borrowed money or on debt. That is an advantage that won't be with us forever and could be exploited to the benefit of the transition.
Yeah, you're right. Amal-Lee, can I turn to you? Heading up climate strategy for the CDC. Could I just ask you to say a little bit more about the work of the CDC and your role in making sure emerging, developing economies get the finance that they need as well?
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, I'm delighted to be here because I've also been working around this new partnership agreement between South Africa and the UK, US, France, Germany and European Commission. And I just want to congratulate the Minister to say, I think this provides exactly the kind of model that we now need to really ensure that all these trillions that we're talking about actually start to flow into the right kinds of investments, the right kinds of assets that South Africa will need for the transition, for a just transition to net zero. And at the same time, I think, ensuring there is enough public funding, which may be grant funding and other public funding, to support the just transition dimension as well. And so I've been delighted to have been involved in that in some way. And I think from CDC's perspective, we are also very much, I think, as Hendrik said, we see so much potential in South Africa. We're looking very closely at green hydrogen. We're looking very closely at the electromobility sector and see that that's where we as a DFI can actually really be additional to the private sector within South Africa in those more innovative types of industries and technologies that are really emerging now in South Africa. And so, our strategy as CDC, we are, we'll be having our new 5-year strategy starting 1st of January. We announced here that we'll be committing of that over £3 billion for climate finance that would be counted as climate finance. And we have now a very strong focus on ensuring that is that South Africa is one of the key countries that we can contribute, that we can invest to enable and support this just energy transition that South Africa has set out. So it is also, just to say a few words, and I wanted to say I was delighted when I was invited to be also on the panel with Hendrik, because I read your article that was in Bloomberg, I think, and I sent it to so many people, actually, to say, look, this is what is needed. When we look at net zero, we ourselves are in the process of finalising our net zero transition plan. And when we look at that, it's how are we ensuring that we are, we are a development finance institution, so of course we are going to invest in South Africa, in India, in other countries. So of course that's what we will be doing. But I think it's really essential that these net zero commitments start to quickly look at how to ensure that they are going to go into the right kinds of assets in the emerging markets. And so, I think that's very much we as a DFI, as CDC, I hope we can help bring other investors along with us, and we will be looking to do more mobilisation of, cross-border private finance in particular, which I think, as Hendrik said, is just not really happening at any scale, let alone the scale that is really, really needed.
Chris, one advantage South Africa has, and I want the Minister to also know he's got that advantage. We have a very vibrant domestic capital market and savings pool, which outside China, not many emerging markets have it organized in that way, which means high risk equity capital can be mobilized domestically alongside with slightly lower risk or international debt capital if equity capital is nervous. Equity capital will always come when they see a real opportunity. So there's a case study here of something that could exceed or an opportunity to exceed expectations, especially now that I hear the CDC is in full flight there.
That's very good. Actually, Hendrik, that does lead me on to a question that I really wanted to ask you about, which is, it's become a bit of a hot button subject around divestment. And there's so much discussion about, is it better to sell up and walk away because that sends a clear message? Is it better to stay engaged? If you stay engaged, at what point should you plan for your exit? But I know this is something you've also written about. So could you give what your view on the divestment issues and how 91 approaches them?
Yeah, I think at 91 we're very, very firm. Divestment is always an option, but in the case of the transition, divestment is self-defeating. Early divestment, unthoughtful divestment, because those cash flows, and in fact the next few years, another advantage of the world, by the way, not only historically low interest rates in the developed world, but we've also got the advantage of carbon intensive resources companies doing really well, which means they have cash flow to invest in the new part of their business. And as shareholders, or as lenders, but in our case mostly as shareholders, at 91's case, we want to encourage them to make an ambitious transition rather than simply return the cash, keep the business the same. If they want to do that, they need to tell us how they're going to run down the business to zero, because after 2040 I don't see much future in most countries, except maybe some very poor countries, for example, for the parts of the coal industry. But right now they're very profitable. They could not only generate the cash to transition themselves, they could also provide for the just part of the transition, i.e. the communities which they currently support. So I think it's a case of active involvement. It's a case of dealing on a country by country, asset by asset basis, how this should be done. What we do know, we have to be net zero by 2050 in aggregate, and some countries will be slower.
I think this is one of those issues that the industry needs to be more thoughtful about, but also clearer,
Yeah.
and work with politicians, because it is such an easy option to go for, the immediate.
I'm very glad Larry Fink yesterday was very clear. You know, and he often is the largest player in our industry, BlackRock. They often get attacked and saying, oh, greenwash. He said, no, we have to stay with these businesses, and that's correct.
Yes. Yes. Minister, can I just turn to you for the next question, which is, again, it's another issue which has been debated long and hard over the last few days here in Glasgow, and obviously more widely as well, around trade and potential trade barriers. So there's lots of discussion around developed countries making very rapid progress, hopefully, to net zero, emerging developing markets being less able to move not quite as quickly as developed markets. But then the worry of a trade barrier being erected between developed markets and developing markets. And I just wondered if this is something that's of concern to you, if it's something that you could address for us.
No, about 10 years ago, we were talking about currency wars after the financial crisis. And even around the vaccine issue, we have somewhat of a trade policy stroke intellectual property battle that's going on between some of the developed countries and developing countries, and it's taking an extraordinary amount of time to take the right kind of decision. A trade barrier will be highly destructive. It will be counterproductive at a time when, with one hand, the developed world is saying, we recognize that you can decarbonize at approximately $7 per ton of carbon, and it'll cost us somewhere between $120 and $400 per ton, and you give that with the right hand, and then with the left hand you say, you're not moving fast enough, so we're going to actually penalize you. So it's irrational. It might suit certain geopolitical objectives, but I think the world that we are talking about from here on is an interdependent world, as many have said, including President Biden yesterday, if I heard him correctly, that we have all got access to the same atmosphere. Others will say we breathe the same air and share the same sun, amongst other things, and share a lot of the oceans as well. So where there is an endeavor to actually create a common project as far as humanity's future survival is concerned, it'll be counterproductive to play geopolitical games. There might be the odd country that might require to be leveraged in some way to move in the right direction. But now is certainly not the time to talk about that. That time might come sometime in the future if there is a dramatic reluctance to move in the right direction. Right now, I repeat, the efforts must go into creating a common platform, a growing consensus amongst all countries, and a singleness of purpose, which is the only way in which we're going to navigate climate change as we move through a multi-decade process. If this was a 2-year project, it's a different proposition.
Yeah.
If we're talking about a multi-decade project, then it's a completely different scene, which requires a phenomenal commitment and leadership maturity to do the right things, behave in the right way, support in the correct manner, and ensure that overall humanity is moving in the right direction.
Yes, thank you, Minister. I think that's absolutely the case, and it's certainly an issue that we, the Investment Association, have given a lot of thought to, because in 5 years' time we'll be further along the track, and we'll know more than we know today. The data sets will be richer, the standards undoubtedly will be higher. And the one thing that always worries me is that hindsight is the cruelest judge, and if we wait until we know everything, we'll never get anything done. So we need to start now in full knowledge that actually we might look back and think, if only we'd have known. But that's why we do need to work with our regulators and policymakers to make sure they're with us on this journey. Otherwise, regulatory problems could follow us, and that would be a tragedy. Amal-Lee, can I come back to you and ask you to say a little bit more about the work of the CDC? Because what I'm really interested in is your practical experience of and your thoughts about how more can be done. What are the better mechanisms that bring public and private sector money to bear on particular projects and initiatives? Could you say a little bit more to us?
Yes, so, well, CDC is, has a very long history in Africa in particular as primarily an equity investor. And, I think we see that, the challenge or our role really is to be able to ensure that we can help those companies that are really struggling in many cases to find the right kind of finance and bring in other investors. I think, as Hendrik said, for a country like South Africa, that really should be about sort of real mobilization of private capital. And that's where I think, we see great opportunities, particularly in these more innovative technologies. We're starting to look at the role of blended finance. That's not something CDC has done previously. We do have a new, it was just announced here actually, a new climate innovative solutions. It's a pilot at the moment and looking to scale that up over the next 5-year strategy period. And actually that's really to help even seed and then grow these early stage types of technologies, companies that are going to be so needed to bring the innovative solutions, both for the net zero transition, but also crucially for also adaptation and resilience, because we know the private sector has to play a role there, and yet the businesses that we're seeing, and we are seeing some really, I would say, incredibly impactful businesses, very small scale. Many of them have already, have only got to where they are because they've benefited from philanthropic funding. So, we want to really also work to accelerate those types of businesses as well, in addition to the adaptation and resilience, in addition to net zero for adaptation and resilience. And also just want to take the opportunity to mention that we've been working with TIPS in South Africa on a just transition financing roadmap as well.
Good. I was about to ask you about that actually, yes. So thank you.
Yes, okay. Yeah, and actually for the very reason that in our own climate strategy, the just transition is one of our 3 building blocks, along with net zero and adaptation and resilience. And so in both South Africa and actually in India, in India actually, I think there's a lot of lessons being learned from South Africa actually, because South Africa, the policy dialogue around just transition is very mature. And so what we as CDC with TIPS, working with some other partners here, LSE in particular, have been looking at how we can be more strategic in our financing for the just transition. And part of that will be looking at how we can help create green jobs, but also not necessarily the green jobs, as long as they're not jobs that are sort of moving backwards from the direction of travel. And looking at, in particular, the areas, the Mpumalanga region in South Africa, which of course where most of the coal mining is. How how can we help create more jobs, more economic opportunities there, and that's not just for us as CDC and other DFIs, but also for the South African private sector, the financial institutions, who actually, many of the banks already, I'm really interested to hear that many of the South African banks are already thinking about this just transition agenda. So, and that's something we've done with our sort of technical assistance facility, CDC Plus, as a way of helping to provide more strategic direction and sort of shape the market moving forward.
Is that something that you've thought about as well, Hendrik, in terms of the transition and the wider picture?
I think at 91, as a commercial investor of risk capital of retirement funds along the risk spectrum, we're looking for the opportunities and the risk. So the risk side, if companies do not develop adequate transition plans that make sense for both the community but for their long-term resilience and survival, we will have to engage very forcefully. On the other hand, we encourage businesses and want to back businesses that exploit the new opportunities, which are going to be substantial. I mean, just think of a markets that have been held back, like South Africa and India, by imported energy costs. If you could replace that with local renewable, your competitive position becomes immeasurably better. So, and in a variety of ways, a transition to a more digital and a more clean economy could be beneficial if you get, and I think the important challenge is to get the educational base right to make sure you've got the people to do it. But there are so many opportunities that need to be backed. And that's why I also want to applaud the philanthropic money. I mean, there's lots of bad being spoken about all the billionaires. Well, actually, the billionaires are rowing in right here. They're busy writing big checks and taking risks that we cannot take with mom and pop's retirement money. But we can come right behind them and participate in the creation of new successful businesses, which I think South Africa will do if we create the right framework. And many other emerging markets will do.
Yes. Yeah. I'm conscious of time. We've only got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to double check with all of you in terms of announcements so far on COP. We've heard good news about the success of GFANZ. We've heard about the establishment of the ISSB, which I think is a tremendous leap forward actually under the FRS Foundation. What else should we be looking for out of COP this year so that we can turn what have been great announcements into some practical reality? So, Amal-Lee, can I start with you, and then Hendrik, and then perhaps, Minister, we could come to you for your final closing remarks because time is rapidly getting away from us. But Amal-Lee, can I start with you in terms of what else would you like to see? And I'm tempted to ask, what are the things that we haven't seen that could be the potential blockers? But what would you like to see?
Yeah. So, well, I'm sorry I've already said it actually. For me, I think we saw it yesterday with the agreement with South Africa, because I think we need to see that kind of country leadership as South Africa is showing. I mean, South Africa now, the updated NDC is the most ambitious end, is consistent with being net zero by 2050. And this is exactly what we need all countries to come forward with. And rightly, as the Minister said, there needs to be sufficient funding on the table, concessional funding, grants, to really help mobilise all the trillions. So everything we've been talking about in terms of GFANZ, it's only really meaningful, I think, if it's getting into the economies of those that really have the biggest needs for infrastructure in particular, for net zero compliant infrastructure. So I would like to see more of these. I'd like to see other countries coming forward, like India and Indonesia, who are also very reliant on coal, coming forward, and maybe they can follow South Africa's leadership, and we can have more of those coming forward between now and COP26.
I have one suggestion besides the fact that the G20 really need to take the ball and run with it after COP, and that is we need to get a transparent, efficient and widely accepted market for carbon. Until you can price the externality with a genuine market-determined price, not just an officially led price, we're going to struggle to get capital markets to work at full speed. So I think that's the next chapter.
There was a concern expressed earlier that we've got the money. So the money seems to be on the table now. The plumbing is aligning itself in a better direction. We should have international standards, which, hallelujah, that's what we've really needed. But the concern expressed was, could regulators pivot in time to deploy it, to work with the industry so that we could deploy it? Because this isn't, as we were saying, a 2 or 3 year project. This is something that actually we need to work collectively on.
Correct.
So my concern is how can we better work with our regulatory authorities, with policymakers, to encourage them to act at pace. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely fair.
Yes.
I was too scared to mention the regulator, but
that's my job. That's my job.
And I think, the network for greening the financial sector, it's I think it's an incredibly impressive network. It grew so quickly and has had very senior engagement and been doing some excellent work. So I think, it is happening. It's and of course, I think regulators like to move collectively together, don't they? Don't want to be ahead of each other.
Indeed, that's true. Minister, in our final couple of minutes, could I please turn to you and ask for your final thoughts and concluding remarks, please?
Oh, well, firstly, thank you very much for this conversation. I think it I'm not in Glasgow, so I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. It certainly begins to set a new benchmark for the kind of conversations that we need to have. Secondly, I think implicit in what we're saying is that there needs to be a paradigm shift amongst policymakers, investors, investment managers, regulators, so that they pivot quickly enough and in a much more agile way to the requirements of the day. And then thirdly, I think we have to concede that for the first 6 months or so, maybe even longer, this is going to be a period of learning by doing. So don't expect a perfect template to emerge within 1 week of starting a transition process at a coal-powered station. Mm-hmm. And perhaps the lesson of the last few weeks is also, whilst being polite, a case, as I indicated earlier on, of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So as the local dynamics and interest groups begin to play themselves out, one is going to see a bit of either a rethink, and I'm trying to be very polite here, or a shifting around in order to accommodate different interests in a particular country environment. And so finally, a single-mindedness is required where we are clear about where we're heading, but we're equally clear that heading in that direction involves a lot more detailed work on the one hand, but it also might require, outside of formal COPs, to have programs, maybe led by institutions like CDC on the let's call it non-governmental side, the 91s of the world on the sort of financial side, or the investment association that you represent, and in terms of public policy, where we are constantly reflecting on lessons learned, adaptations to be made, and corrections if we make mistakes, which we will as we go forward. But let me congratulate you on convening an absolutely important discussion. Thanks a lot. And it's good to meet Hendrik, I know well, but it's good to meet Amal-Lee on this platform.
Minister, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And can I also thank Amal-Lee for your time, and Hendrik, as always, a great pleasure. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for joining us today. May I wish you all the very best. This is not the last COP where finance has been at the heart of the discussion. I think from now on we have turned the page, and it's about the effective use of finance to deliver on the great climate challenge that all of us have no option but to be motivated to achieve. Thank you all.